I spent most of my childhood near the flat, dry plains of northern Arizona. My family moved away many years ago, but in late 2009 I drove back there by myself for a short break. I was 28 at that time, working too many hours, barely sleeping, always staring at a computer screen, and I wanted silence more than anything. I rented a small cabin north of Winslow, far away from any town, with nothing around it except scattered juniper trees, dusty soil, and long miles of empty space that looked the same in every direction. I picked that place because I thought I wanted peace, but after the first night, I realized I might have chosen the wrong kind of quiet. The cabin was old and faded, built sometime in the 70s, with a metal roof that rattled when the wind got strong, and inside it smelled a bit like dry wood and old dust that had settled over years. There were 2 rooms, a small kitchen, and a back door that led into wide open land. There was no fence, no neighbors, no lights anywhere out there. The first morning, the silence felt good. I woke up early, made coffee using the old kettle, and walked out behind the cabin, watching sunrise spread slowly over the empty plain. The air felt cold and thin, and I could hear my own steps crushing the dry soil, which felt strangely loud because there were no other sounds. No cars, no voices, not even birds that morning. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, but also how exposed I felt, like I was the only person left in that part of the state. Later that afternoon, I took a slow walk toward a low ridge about half a mile behind the cabin. From up there, I could look down over miles of open land. Everything looked dry except a line of trees far to the east, where there was some kind of dry creek bed. That was the only place that looked like real cover. I stayed up there until the sun dropped low and the temperature started falling fast. I didn't want to walk back in the dark, so I headed home. I noticed boot tracks in the dust near the cabin. They weren't mine. They looked old, or maybe the wind had softened them, so I didn't think much about it. That night, everything changed. I was lying in bed reading when I heard a single scraping sound on the back wall of the cabin. At first I thought it was the wind pushing something against the boards, but when I listened closer, the wind wasn't blowing at all. Then I heard it again, slower this time, like something dragging lightly along the siding. My heart started beating faster because I knew there shouldn't be anybody out here, especially late at night. I got up, moved quietly to the kitchen, and looked out through the small window, but it was pitch dark and I couldn't see anything. I stood there for a long time, trying to hear more, but everything went silent again. I waited, then finally went back to bed, but I barely slept and woke up several times, listening to that silence, trying to convince myself it was probably an animal rubbing against the cabin. The next morning, I walked around back and saw fresh tracks in the dirt, definitely boot tracks, circling around the cabin. The prints were sharp, meaning they were recent. I crouched down, tried to see which direction they came from, but they blurred out a few yards away where the ground got harder and rockier. That made my stomach tighten a little, because it wasn't a hiker or camper passing by. Whoever it was walked right up to the cabin and walked around it. I decided to stay inside most of that day, reading, trying not to overthink it. Around late afternoon, I heard something again behind the cabin, like a soft clack sound. I looked through the back kitchen window and I swear I saw a shape standing near the trees. It looked like someone tall, wearing something light-colored, maybe a coat or jacket. But the person moved almost instantly behind one of the larger junipers when I shifted my eyes. I stayed staring but saw nothing after that, so maybe my eyes played tricks on me in the uneven light. That night I couldn't relax at all. Every noise felt sharper, and every gust of wind made me jump. Around midnight, I heard that same slow scrape against the back wall again. Not strong, just like someone dragging a finger or a stick across the wood. I stayed frozen in bed, staring at the darkness, unable to move. After a long time, it stopped. I didn't sleep for the rest of that night. By morning, I already made up my mind that if anything else happened, I would pack up and leave. After breakfast, I went outside again and checked the dirt. The tracks were back. Fresh ones, almost identical shape as before. The strange thing was that the prints stopped a few feet away from the cabin, like the person had stood there facing the wall for a while. Around noon, I heard something strange behind the cabin. I stepped outside slowly and saw a piece of animal skin hanging from one of the low branches behind the cabin, like someone tied it there on purpose. It looked like dried coyote skin, stretched and stiff. The fur was worn and dirty, and I could see knife marks along one edge. I felt something cold settle deep in my chest when I saw it. That wasn't something an animal would do. Someone put it there. I left it alone and went straight inside. I didn't have cell service out there, so I couldn't call anyone. I kept thinking about those stories people tell in that region, those old stories about what they call skinwalkers. Most people treat it like some strange local legend, but what I started thinking was much more real and simple. There might be someone out here who hunted animals, skinned them, and maybe lived hidden out in those trees. Someone who didn't want strangers nearby. I closed all the curtains and moved a chair against the back door, even though I felt stupid doing it. The day moved painfully slow. Every hour felt heavy. I didn't even make dinner, just ate crackers and water and sat by the kitchen table listening to the wind hit the windows. When darkness came again, I turned off all the lights and sat awake in the living room. Around midnight, that same dragging sound started again, but this time it moved along the wall slowly toward the back door. My breath felt stuck in my throat. The scraping got lower, like someone crouched down near the ground. I didn't move an inch. Then I heard a soft, almost careful breathing through the gaps of the old door. Slow, steady breathing, like someone kneeling just inches on the other side. My whole body was shaking, but I stayed silent. After a moment, the breathing stopped. I waited maybe 2 hours, barely blinking, until I saw first light creeping into the windows. The moment I could see outside clearly enough, I packed everything I had fast. When I stepped outside, I saw new tracks in the dirt leading away toward the creek bed line of trees. And lying on the ground, right against the back step, I saw what looked like another piece of animal hide. But this one still had dried blood along one side, darker and fresher. It looked placed there deliberately, almost like a warning. I stuffed my bag in the truck and started driving down that dirt road faster than I should have. Dust flew up behind me and I didn't look in the mirrors once. I didn't stop until I reached the highway near Holbrook. When I got to a gas station, I finally felt like I could breathe again. A few days later, after I returned home, I called the rental owner and told him someone had been around the cabin. He sounded calm and said he'd send someone to check the property. Weeks later, he sent me an email saying he never found anything and no one in the area reported anything strange. He didn't mention the skins or the tracks. He just said sometimes animals scratch around the cabins at night. I knew what I heard, and I knew what I saw. Someone was out there, someone who moved silently, who hunted and skinned animals, and who walked around cabins at night while people slept only a thin wall away. People call that kind of thing a skinwalker because it fits some old story, but the truth feels much worse. Because if it was just a person living out there, hiding, watching, and creeping around cabins, that's something real. Something you can't explain by legends. I didn't tell anyone else the full story for a long time because I knew how it would sound, but sometimes late at night, when everything gets quiet and I hear some random noise outside my own house, I remember that breathing on the other side of the cabin door. And I keep thinking about how whoever that was, they weren't afraid of being seen, and they knew exactly where I was staying. I haven't been back to Arizona since, and I probably never will. I arrived in the countryside early in the evening, sometime in late October of 2019, after a long drive from the city. I remember the roads getting narrower and rougher the deeper I went into the rural area. The sun was already low, almost sliding behind the distant hills, leaving a soft orange glow across the open fields. My reason for coming out there was simple enough. I needed a place to clear my head after a stressful year at work, and a friend of mine had once mentioned an old rental cabin near a wide meadow. I had saved the location and decided to book it for a full week. It looked peaceful from the photos, small, wooden, quiet, and far enough from town that I could actually hear my own thoughts. When I finally reached the property, I noticed how isolated it really was. There were no nearby houses from what I could see, just long stretches of overgrown grass and tall, thin trees swaying in the wind. The gravel driveway led up to a simple wooden cabin that looked like it had been built many years earlier. The siding was faded and the windows looked like they hadn't been cleaned in a long time. A metal roof sat above, reflecting the last bits of daylight. I felt a strange mix of calm and uncertainty, but I reminded myself that was the whole point of coming out there. I wanted something different from my usual crowded surroundings. The air felt colder than I expected. I could smell soil, damp grass, and something old that I couldn't quite identify. Maybe the woods or the cabin itself had a certain scent from years of weather and seasons. I unlocked the door and pushed it open. The inside was dim, and even with the lights switched on, it felt slightly darker than a normal room. The furniture was plain and old, with a small table, 2 chairs, and a dusty shelf holding a few outdated books about wildlife and farming. The walls were wooden panels that had darkened over time, and the floor made soft, creaking sounds with every step I took. I spent the first hour carrying my things inside, checking the heating system, and making sure the place was safe enough to stay in. Everything seemed mostly normal except for a few details. The back window had scratches on the outside of the glass, long and uneven scratches that didn't look like they were made by branches. They were lower on the glass too, almost at knee height, like something had scraped across it again and again. At first, I assumed it must have been a dog or maybe some animal trying to get in at night. I tried not to think too much about it. By the time the sky turned completely dark, a cold wind started moving through the trees outside. I could hear it dragging across the cabin walls and roof, making soft rattling sounds. The nearest town was about 15 kilometers away, and the road back wasn't something I wanted to drive at night. I decided to just settle in. I made myself something simple to eat, and then sat on the small couch, trying to read one of the old books from the shelf. The words felt boring, and I kept losing focus because of strange noises outside. I told myself it was just nature and old wood reacting to temperature changes. When I went to bed around 10, the place felt colder than it should have. I kept the small electric heater on, but the cold still crept in through the floorboards and the thin walls. I woke sometime around midnight to a faint sound like footsteps in the grass outside. They weren't heavy steps, more like slow shifting movements. I listened closely, lying completely still in the dark. The sound came from the left side of the cabin near the kitchen window. Then it stopped suddenly. I waited a few more minutes, staring into the darkness of the small bedroom, and eventually convinced myself it might have been a wild animal looking for food. After a while, the silence returned and I fell back asleep, though not very deeply. When morning came, the sunlight looked pale through the curtains. I stepped outside to get some fresh air and noticed something that made my chest tighten. The thin layer of mud near the cabin foundation had marks that looked like the shape of a shoe sole. Not a boot, not something wide, but narrow and flat like a regular walking shoe. The tracks seemed to go around the cabin in a half circle before disappearing into the grass. That bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I tried to reason with myself, thinking maybe the owner or some maintenance worker had come by before I arrived. But the mud looked fresh, like it had been stepped on during the night. I felt uneasy, but I forced myself to think logically. I tried to continue my day normally. I made breakfast, walked around the field to get used to the area, and took a few photos of the scenery. The silence around me was so heavy that even the smallest sound felt louder than usual. I could hear distant birds and the soft movement of wind, but nothing else. I expected to see signs of wildlife, maybe rabbits or deer, but everything felt strangely empty. Later that afternoon, while walking behind the cabin, I noticed something else odd. The tall grass had sections that were bent down, almost forming a rough path leading away from the cabin into the edge of the woods. The path looked as if someone had walked through repeatedly over time. The grass wasn't cut or pushed by machinery. It was flattened like footsteps had pressed over it again and again. It continued into the tree line and disappeared deeper in. I stared at it for a long moment. There was a feeling like someone had been passing by or maybe even watching the cabin from a distance. I didn't want to follow it, so I turned back, trying not to let my imagination run wild. That night, I went to bed earlier, hoping proper sleep might help me feel less paranoid. But around the same time as the previous night, I woke again. I didn't hear footsteps this time, but I heard something lightly brushing against the outside wall. It moved slowly from one corner to the other, like someone dragging fabric or fingers along the wood. I lay still, breathing quietly, trying not to make any sound at all. The brushing lasted maybe 10 seconds, and then it stopped completely. I waited in the darkness, feeling every beat of my heart, until everything seemed quiet again. My mind went through different explanations, but none of them felt believable. By morning, I realized I wasn't comfortable staying much longer. I still had several days booked, but something about that cabin made me feel vulnerable in a way I hadn't expected. I walked around the cabin again, and that's when I saw something that made my stomach drop. At the bottom of the back window where the scratches were, a small piece of wood under the frame had been chipped away, like someone had tried to loosen it. The scratches on the glass also seemed slightly more noticeable, like new ones had been added during the night. I couldn't deny it anymore. Someone had been close to the cabin, possibly trying to get inside at night. I packed my things slowly, keeping the cabin door locked the entire time. I didn't bother cleaning or organizing much. All I wanted was to get out of there and reach the main road before evening. When I placed my bags in the car, I turned around and looked at the cabin one last time. It stood there silently, the windows dark, the old wood almost blending with the trees behind it. I felt watched even though I didn't see anyone. The wind was light, but the grass near the woods moved like something had just passed through. During the drive back, every kilometer felt like a weight lifting off me. My hands shook slightly on the steering wheel, and I kept checking the rearview mirror even though there were no cars behind me. When I finally reached a more populated area, I felt able to breathe normally again. I stopped at a roadside station and stayed there for a long time before continuing home. Even now, thinking back on it, I believe someone had been living near that cabin or possibly using it without the owner knowing. Maybe someone was hiding out in those woods, watching for opportunities or trying to see who came and went. I don't know who it was or what they wanted, but I know for certain those footsteps and those markings weren't accidents. I learned after that week that isolation might look peaceful in pictures, but when you actually experience it and feel that something unknown is close by, it becomes something else entirely. I never went back to that area again, and I don't plan to. The memory of hearing something move just outside my thin wooden walls in the dark is enough to keep me away from any countryside cabin for a very long time. It was the fall of 1997, and I had decided to take a week off from the city, desperate to escape the endless gray buildings, car horns, and fluorescent office lights that had slowly eaten away at me over the last few years. I was 27 at the time, tired, anxious, and looking for somewhere quiet to think. That somewhere had turned out to be a small cabin tucked deep in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, about 20 miles off the nearest paved road. I had found it through an old pamphlet at a travel shop in Charleston. Dusty, faded, and offering seclusion, serenity, and simplicity. It had sounded perfect. The drive itself was an adventure. My old Toyota Corolla groaned over the narrow, twisting mountain roads, lined with dense pine forests that seemed to close in on the car the further I went. By the time I finally reached the small dirt path that led to the cabin, the sky had already darkened into a deep, bruised gray. The air smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves, the scent heavy after a week of intermittent rainfall. The cabin was a small wooden structure, rough-hewn logs stacked together with chinking in between, moss creeping along the roof shingles. There was no electricity, no running water, just a rusted metal stove and a few lanterns left behind by previous visitors. It was isolated in a way that made my chest tighten with both excitement and unease. The first night was quiet, almost peaceful. I spent it lighting a small fire in the stove, reading by its dim, flickering light, and listening to the rain pound steadily against the roof. It wasn't until the second night that the unease began. The rain had come back heavier, relentless, drumming in sheets against the cabin walls. Every gust of wind made the old wooden frame creak and shift, and each time I heard it, I felt a jolt of panic. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just an old building settling, just the wind, but a small knot of anxiety grew in my stomach. Around midnight, I woke to a sudden, sharp noise. Not the rain, not the wind, but something heavier, something that struck the cabin with intent. It sounded like a branch, or maybe something bigger, hitting the side of the cabin. My heart slammed in my chest, and I froze, listening. The rain had masked most other sounds, but now, through the patter of the storm, I could hear faint, dragging noises outside, scraping over the wet leaves and mud. I grabbed the flashlight I had left on the nightstand and crept to the window. The forest was dark, just shadows and rain, but I could make out vague shapes moving near the treeline. Trees swayed violently in the storm, but these shapes moved differently, deliberately closer. My mind raced. There were no neighbors for miles, no road anyone would take at this hour, no logical explanation. My hands shook as I stepped back from the window, nearly dropping the flashlight, and I felt my pulse spike. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the stove, its flames low but steady, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. The sound of something moving outside continued, muffled by the rain, yet persistent enough to gnaw at my nerves. Every now and then, a loud crack would make me jump. It could have been a branch falling, an animal, anything, but I knew something was out there, moving, watching. The night dragged on in a torturous mix of storm, darkness, and my own racing thoughts. By the morning, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the sun fought its way through the thick clouds, casting weak, gray light over the forest. I forced myself to step outside, determined to check for fallen trees or signs of damage. Mud sucked at my boots as I walked around the cabin, water dripping from my jacket. Everything seemed normal. Branches broken, yes, but nothing out of the ordinary for a storm. Still, my unease lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me, of being watched, even in broad daylight. That afternoon, I decided to explore the area, hoping some physical exertion would help calm my nerves. The forest around the cabin was dense, with a mix of pines and oaks. The ground was slippery with mud, leaves sticking to my boots. I stumbled across a small creek not far from the cabin, the water brown and frothy from the rain. As I bent down to cup my hands and drink, I noticed something in the mud. Footprints. Human footprints, heavy and wide, pressed into the wet earth, leading from the edge of the forest toward the cabin. My heart sank. They were too large to be mine, too fresh to have been there long. I followed them a short distance but lost the trail as it entered the thicker trees. Panic returned, sharp and immediate. I hurried back to the cabin, checking every corner as I went. I locked the door, pushed a chair under the handle, and stacked some firewood against it. My rational mind told me it could have been a hiker or someone lost in the storm, but my instincts screamed otherwise. The day passed slowly, the forest around me silent, almost mocking in its stillness. That night, the rain returned with a vengeance. Thunder rumbled overhead, lightning flashing across the sky, illuminating the cabin in brief, blinding bursts. Around 2 a.m., I woke again to the sound of movement outside. This time it was different, louder, closer, deliberate. Someone or something was trying to get in. My stomach churned as I realized the sounds were footsteps circling the cabin, heavy and slow, dragging slightly in the mud. My hands went cold as I clutched the baseball bat I had grabbed from the trunk of my car earlier. The night stretched into hours of tense vigilance. Couldn't sleep, couldn't relax. Every creak of the cabin floor, every gust of wind, every roll of thunder made me jump. I huddled in the corner, bat in hand, waiting, watching. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The forest went quiet. The storm slowed. The oppressive sense of being hunted lifted slightly, leaving me exhausted but alive. By dawn, the rain had ceased completely. I dared to peek outside. The ground was waterlogged, but no footprints were anywhere near the cabin. No signs that anyone had been there. My heart was still hammering, my body trembling, but the immediate danger seemed gone. I realized, with a strange sense of clarity, that my panic and fear had amplified every noise, every shadow. The storm had created conditions for my mind to invent threats, to convince me I was being watched. Still, the footprints in the creek mud that afternoon were real. I remembered they had to be someone nearby before the storm. But now, with daylight, nothing remained. I stayed in the cabin that day, exhausted and tense, but I used the time to organize, clean, and make myself comfortable. I cooked a simple meal on the stove, folded my wet clothes, and stacked wood for warmth. By nightfall, I felt calmer. The silence now felt like a friend rather than a predator. I realized the key to surviving the night had been patience, vigilance, and keeping fear in check. I left the cabin 2 days later, driving back to Charleston with mud still clinging to my boots, my nerves raw but intact. The experience had shaken me, yes, but it had also taught me something valuable. The world is full of unpredictable things. Storms, wildlife, the unknown, and the human mind often amplifies fear when we feel alone and powerless. But survival doesn't always require heroics, bravery, or confrontation. Sometimes it's about patience, awareness, and waiting out the storm until sunlight returns. Even now, decades later, I think about that rainy night in the cabin. The smell of wet pine, the sound of rain on wood, the fear that seemed to wrap itself around me like a living thing. It's all etched into my memory. And yet, the ending was simple and clear. I survived, intact, wiser, and with a newfound respect for both nature and my own capacity to endure. I never should have gone hiking that early spring. It was 2003, and I was 24, freshly out of college, craving something different, something to feel alive. I drove out of Asheville just after sunrise, the fog clinging to the valleys like it was hiding something, and the mountains ahead looked both inviting and menacing. I had been in the woods plenty of times before, but there was something different about this trail, the way it vanished into dense firs and pines, how uneven the old forest road had become, covered in mud and scattered branches. I parked my old Jeep at the edge of the forest, checked my pack one last time, water, granola, compass, flashlight, and a small first aid kit, and started walking. The trail was narrow, flanked by thick undergrowth, and the smell of wet earth filled my nose. Birds chirped intermittently, but there was a silence deeper than usual, like the forest was holding its breath. The further I walked, the more I noticed how isolated I truly was. No other hikers, no distant cars, no planes overhead, just the occasional rustle of leaves or the snap of a twig under my boots. After about 2 hours, the trail forked unexpectedly. One path seemed more traveled, its dirt packed down, while the other, overgrown with thorny bushes, looked like it hadn't been used in years. I don't know why, but I chose the overgrown path. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe a foolish sense of adventure. By the time I realized how thick the brush had become, I was too far in to turn back without tearing my pants and scratching my arms bloody. I had been walking for nearly another hour when I saw it. A cabin. It was small, wooden, with peeling paint and a sagging roof. Smoke curled lazily from a crooked chimney, and I froze, unsure what to do. The cabin seemed lived in, though there was no vehicle nearby, no sign of anyone moving around. Something about it made my stomach tighten, a sense that it was deliberately hidden from the main path, like whoever lived there didn't want visitors. I didn't approach immediately. I circled the cabin, careful to stay in the shadows of the trees, and noticed subtle details. A line of boots outside the door, weathered and muddy. A stack of firewood neatly piled. A few tin cans and a jar of something orange on the porch railing. The smell of wood smoke mixed with damp soil was strong. Whoever was here was living simply, isolated by choice. My curiosity overpowered my caution, though I kept my distance. Then I saw her. She appeared at the corner of the cabin. A woman. Not young. Maybe mid-40s, but strong, wiry, with long, dark hair streaked with gray. She wore a thick, faded sweater and worn jeans, her hands busy with something I couldn't quite make out. She moved with precise, deliberate motions, chopping or arranging something, but she stopped mid-motion and looked straight in my direction. I ducked behind a tree immediately, my heart slammed in my chest. She didn't shout or come after me. She just watched, standing still, almost statuesque, for what felt like an eternity. I tried to convince myself she was used to people trespassing and was sizing me up, but there was an unease in her stance that got under my skin. The silence around the cabin deepened, interrupted only by the occasional creak of the roof or a gust of wind through the pine needles. I debated whether to retreat, but then my curiosity won again. I needed to know what was happening here, who she was, why she lived like this. I crept closer, careful to keep my steps soft. I could see now she was sorting something into jars, herbs and roots mostly, but there was a dead deer hanging in a corner of the porch, skinned and gutted. My stomach turned. This wasn't just a hermit or a recluse. She was surviving entirely off the land, entirely alone. I thought about turning back again, but I froze when she suddenly glanced over her shoulder, her eyes sharp and unblinking. She didn't move, didn't speak, but I felt the weight of her gaze as if she could see right through me. I made the mistake of stepping on a dry twig. The snap echoed in the silence. Her head snapped toward me immediately. Panic surged, and I bolted back toward the trail. The forest seemed denser on the way back, the branches clawing at my arms, roots threatening to trip me. I didn't dare look back until I was sure I was far enough. But then I stopped. I realized she wasn't following me. She hadn't moved from the porch. She simply watched until I disappeared from view. I spent the next hour trying to retrace my path. Every turn looked the same. Shadows of the trees stretched like fingers. The sun was beginning to drop behind the mountains, and the forest seemed to grow heavier, oppressive. I realized my Jeep could be hours away if I didn't find a main path soon. Panic was rising, but I forced myself to slow down, listen, breathe. I followed the faint sound of a creek, remembering from earlier maps that streams usually led back to larger paths. Eventually, the creek led me to a wider trail, and I recognized landmarks from when I started. Relief hit me, but a lingering unease remained. I kept thinking of her. How calm she had been, the precision of her movements, the quiet dominance of her presence. Something about her was controlled, calculated. I realized the cabin, the fire, the deer, the herbs. This woman had mastered complete isolation. and she didn't want anyone in her space. By the time I returned to my Jeep, night had fallen. I sat in the driver's seat, shivering not entirely from the cold. I replayed every detail, every movement. I thought about how easy it would have been for me to be caught, how fragile the line was between curiosity and danger in such isolation. I drove slowly back toward Asheville, eyes on the road but my mind on the cabin, on the woman who had watched me like a hawk. Weeks later, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I researched missing person reports, hermit stories, local ranger logs, but found nothing about her. It was like she had carved herself out of the world entirely. I never went back, though sometimes I wondered what had driven her to live that way. Fear, necessity, or a choice no one else could understand. Whatever it was, she had created her own rules, her own world. And in that forest, I had been nothing more than a fleeting, unwelcome shadow. In the end, the experience changed the way I viewed the woods. I'd always loved them, thought of them as peaceful, calming, a place to escape. But after that day, I realized the woods were neutral. They were alive with their own rhythms, but some parts belonged to people who existed entirely outside ordinary life. And some people, like that woman, were so self-contained and vigilant, they made you realize how vulnerable you really are when you intrude, even unknowingly. I never saw her again, but I never forgot her either. And every time I drive through those mountains now, I glance at the overgrown paths, wondering who's watching, wondering what quiet lives might be unfolding just beyond the line of sight, in a world carefully built and fiercely defended. I had been a park ranger in the northern forests of Montana for just over 5 years, and I thought I had seen it all. The overturned canoes in spring floods, bears rummaging through abandoned campsites, hikers getting lost in the snow-laden pines. But nothing in my experience had prepared me for the morning we found the cabin. It was early November of 2019, the kind of cold that seeps past your jacket and bites into your bones, the kind that makes the forest seem unnervingly silent. The call came through on the radio around 6:30 a.m. Ranger Thompson, we have a report of a possible dead body near the old Millstone cabin. Teams already on site are requesting backup. I had been partnered with Ranger Jim Hawkins that season, a burly man with a thick beard and eyes that missed nothing. The old Millstone cabin was at least 7 miles off the main trail, nestled in a shallow valley surrounded by dense spruce and birch. It was the sort of place hikers sometimes wandered past, thinking it abandoned, and then suddenly realized it had been sitting there for decades. We geared up quickly, boots, coats, gloves, radios, flashlights, and began the trek through the frost-covered underbrush. The air was heavy with damp leaves and the lingering smell of pine sap. As we hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Not the usual wildlife eyes, but something that pressed on the back of your neck, like the forest itself was aware of us. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the trail markers and the crunch of frozen leaves under our boots. By the time we crested the last ridge, the cabin came into view. It was small, the wood weathered and gray, with a sagging roof that looked like it could collapse under the weight of the first heavy snow. Windows were boarded, but a faint light seemed to flicker through the cracks. My stomach tightened. Even from a distance, it smelled wrong. An acrid metallic stench that made my throat close up. Jim and I approached cautiously, moving quietly. The forest around us was eerily still. No birds, no squirrels, just the occasional distant snap of a branch. The closer we got, the stronger the smell became, and then I saw it. A leg, pale and protruding from under the cabin's side porch. I froze. My training kicked in, but my heart was hammering. I motioned to Jim and we edged closer together. The porch was unstable, rotting at the edges, so we had to step carefully. When I crouched to get a better look, I realized the body wasn't fully visible. The man, because it was clearly a man, was sprawled awkwardly, half under the cabin, his clothes torn and dirt-caked. His eyes were wide open, staring at nothing. His skin had already started turning an unnatural shade, and the smell was almost unbearable. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to breathe through my mouth and examine the scene. The cabin itself was in worse condition than I remembered. The door hung off its hinges, and the interior was a chaotic mess of overturned furniture, broken plates, and old moldy blankets. The floorboards creaked under our weight, threatening to give way. I noticed something strange. Nothing in the cabin had been disturbed recently, no signs of forced entry, and yet the body outside suggested someone had been there in the last day or two. Whoever he was, he hadn't come out of the woods peacefully. We called it in. Dispatch confirmed that this was now a crime scene. I radioed the coroner and local law enforcement, trying to keep my hands steady while writing down observations. The body's position, the direction it had fallen, the signs of trauma. As we waited, Jim and I carefully moved around the cabin, checking for more clues. That's when we found the footprints. Not animal tracks, but human footprints leading in and out of the back door. They were fresh, pressed deep into the muddy soil, suggesting someone heavier had walked here recently. I felt a cold dread settle in my chest. Whoever had been here with the man was still out there, somewhere in these woods. The thought made every shadow seem alive, every rustle of leaves a potential threat. The wind picked up, carrying the faint echo of something scraping against the cabin. Metal on wood, and I couldn't tell if it was our imagination or something else entirely. By the time the coroner arrived, the day had grown gray and overcast, the kind of day where it seems like the sun might never break through the clouds. We stepped back as they examined the body, confirming the man had been dead for roughly 24 to 36 hours, likely struck or shoved from the cabin. Nothing supernatural, no fairy tale nonsense, just the violent, abrupt end to a human life in the middle of nowhere. After the coroner and detectives finished, Jim and I began the painstaking process of checking the cabin for evidence. I found a small, blood-stained hatchet tucked under the bed frame, likely the weapon used in the attack. There were signs of a struggle, broken dishes, scratches on the walls, the faint smear of blood across the floorboards. Whoever had been here had left in a hurry, but the fresh footprints showed they weren't far. We stayed until nightfall, marking the area and setting up temporary barricades around the cabin, then returned to the ranger station to write our reports. Sleep didn't come easy that night. The image of the man, sprawled and lifeless under that rotting porch, haunted me. Even in my apartment, I could still smell the metallic tang in the back of my throat, feel the chill of that November air pressing through my jacket. Over the next week, law enforcement tracked down the suspect. He had fled on foot, attempting to disappear into the vast forest. Jim and I helped coordinate search parties, marking trails and setting checkpoints. Eventually, he was caught hiding in a shallow cave near the river, malnourished and paranoid. He confessed, admitting he had argued with the man over stolen supplies in the cabin, and things escalated too quickly. The explanation was simple, grim, and disturbingly human. The aftermath left a lasting impression on me. I returned to the cabin a few months later, after the snow had melted, to inspect it for safety and potential hikers stumbling into danger. The forest had begun to reclaim it. Moss growing over the porch, small shrubs pushing through the floorboards, the smell of decay mostly washed away by rain. The body was gone, removed officially, but the cabin itself retained a silence that was hard to shake. Felt empty, yes, but also watchful, like it remembered the violence that had occurred there. I think about that day often, especially during quiet patrols when the forest is still and the wind whispers through the trees. The experience taught me how fragile life can be, how quickly something ordinary, a hike, a cabin, a cold morning, can turn into something deadly. And yet, it also reminded me of the importance of vigilance, patience, and careful observation. The forest doesn't forgive carelessness, and neither do people who are capable of violence. Years later, I still patrol that stretch of forest, and the cabin remains a landmark, a warning more than anything else. Hikers give it a wide berth, and the locals tell stories, though none as detailed as the truth. The truth is simple. A man lost his life, a suspect was caught, and the forest stayed the same. Indifferent, vast, and quiet. That morning, the smell, the sight, the sense of being watched, all of it, it stays with me. It's part of why I became a ranger, and it's also why I respect every step I take in those woods. No ghosts, no shadows moving on their own, no fairy tales. Just the raw, unfiltered reality of a human life ending violently in the middle of a forest that doesn't care. And that, I've learned, is scarier than anything else. I had been looking forward to that trip for months. The cabin was way out in the northern forests of Minnesota, tucked away near the edge of the Superior National Forest. I had turned 30 the year before, and this solo hunting trip was supposed to be a way to clear my head, escape the noise of the city, and reconnect with the kind of peace you can only find when the trees outnumber people 100 to 1. The year was 2016, late October, and the air had that sharp, cold bite that hinted at winter but hadn't fully settled in yet. I remember the drive vividly. The roads were narrow, twisting through dense pine and birch, littered with patches of ice and fallen leaves. Every so often, a lone deer would dart across the road, frozen for just a second before vanishing into the shadows. I kept my speed slow, even though the cabin owner had assured me the trail was easy to find. There was something about those empty woods that demanded caution. When I finally reached the cabin, it was smaller than I had imagined, more of a hunting shack than a cabin. The wood was gray and weathered, the roof sagging slightly in the middle, and the windows were streaked with dirt and condensation. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney, meaning someone had been here recently, or maybe they'd left it smoldering before heading back to civilization. I parked the truck on the muddy slope and stepped out, the crunch of wet leaves under my boots echoing unnaturally in the stillness. The interior smelled of old pine, must, and the faint tang of dried blood. Not unpleasant, but it reminded me that this place had been used for hunting before. There were two small rooms, one with a bed, a wood stove, and a few cabinets. The other served as a tiny kitchen. A rough wooden table sat in the middle, surrounded by 4 chairs, each one worn and scratched from years of use. I set down my pack and gun case, letting the silence settle around me. After unpacking, I walked outside to scout the nearby area. The trees were thick, the ground littered with fallen branches and rocks. I found a small creek not far from the cabin, water dark and moving swiftly, reflecting the late afternoon sky in patches of gray and gold. Birds were mostly silent, and the only other sounds were the occasional rustle of branches, the whisper of wind through the pines. I made a mental note of the area for hunting the next morning and returned to the cabin as the sun began to dip behind the trees. That night, the forest felt different. It was quiet in a way that made the mind start filling in the blanks. Every snap of a twig outside the cabin made my pulse jump. I had hunted enough to know that most of it was probably small animals, squirrels or raccoons, maybe a fox. But my imagination, fueled by isolation and shadows, turned each sound into something bigger, something closer. I stoked the stove, letting the fire crackle, and tried to focus on routine. Clean my rifle, prepare my gear for the morning, eat a cold dinner from a can. Around midnight, I woke to a sound I couldn't immediately place. It wasn't a twig snapping, not really. It was more deliberate, heavy. Footsteps. I froze, heart hammering. I was alone out here, or so I had thought. The cabin door was closed, latched with a simple wooden bolt. Whoever it was would have had to come through the woods without leaving any obvious tracks. I listened. Footsteps stopped. Then, very faint, there was a sound like something scraping against the outside wall of the cabin. I stayed still, gripping my flashlight and rifle. The fire in the stove had died down, leaving the room dim and shadowed. I waited for what felt like hours, but when I finally worked up the nerve to move, there was nothing. No footprints, no marks on the door, no sign of anyone at all. My pulse slowly returned to normal, and I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal testing the perimeter. That night, I didn't sleep much, keeping my rifle close and the flashlight on the table. The next day, I went out early. The forest was foggy, the kind of low, gray mist that clings to the ground and drifts between trees. I hunted for hours, saw a few deer but none I could ethically take. My senses were sharper than usual. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow crossing my path made me uneasy. Around noon, I decided to head back to the cabin, feeling the fatigue of the early morning and the cold creeping through my layers. That's when I saw the first sign that someone had been here recently. The firewood pile at the back of the cabin had been disturbed, split wood scattered around, and there were fresh footprints in the mud, large, booted prints. They were human, definitely, and they hadn't been there when I arrived. My stomach sank. Whoever had been here could still be around. I considered leaving immediately, but my truck was still a few miles down the dirt road. I made a careful plan to go inside, grab my gear, and keep my eyes open. Back in the cabin, I tried to act normal, but every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind against the walls, set me on edge. I finished packing quickly, keeping my rifle across my lap. Then I heard it again, the faintest sound of a door opening outside. Not the cabin door, something else. I froze. Whoever it was had keys, or maybe they had been watching me. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly slipped out the back door. There was no one there, but the truck was gone. My stomach dropped. I ran my mind through possibilities. Maybe I had parked in the wrong place? No, I remembered the exact spot. Someone had taken my truck. And then I noticed the other signs. The tailgate had been smashed, and the ground showed tire tracks leading deeper into the forest, towards a rough logging trail. Panic set in, but I forced myself to think. I couldn't run blindly. I grabbed my rifle, checked the chamber, and followed the tracks, staying low and moving carefully. Hours passed. The tracks led to a small clearing with an abandoned hunting shack, smaller than the cabin but clearly used occasionally. My truck was there, smashed worse than I had thought, and inside, I could see someone had rifled through my packs. I kept my distance, watching. No one was there now, but I could feel the danger lingering, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I realized then that whoever had done this wasn't gone. They were still somewhere nearby, watching, waiting for nightfall when the woods would make a single person almost invisible. I made a choice. I would leave by foot, follow a logging trail that eventually connected to a state highway. I hid in the underbrush, avoided obvious tracks, and moved slowly through the trees. The forest was relentless, branches tearing at my jacket, cold sap sticking to my gloves, mud pulling at my boots. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, matching mine, but every time I turned, nothing was there. Only the occasional hint of movement, a shadow at the corner of my vision. It took hours, but finally, I saw signs of civilization. An old power line, then a narrow gravel road. I ran the last few hundred meters and flagged down a passing car, explaining my story between gasps for air. Police came, and eventually they investigated the area. They found tracks near the cabin indicating someone had been stalking me for at least a day, possibly longer. My truck was recovered later, stripped for parts, but nothing else was taken. Whoever had been in those woods that night had vanished completely, leaving no trace. I never went back to that part of Minnesota. Even years later, I can't forget the quiet, the shadows, the feeling of being watched in a place that was supposed to be safe. The memory of that hunting trip lingers in my mind, a sharp reminder that the woods are only as peaceful as the people or predators you share them with. And sometimes, the real terror isn't the cold or the dark. It's knowing someone is out there, silent, patient, and waiting. I drove up to a small rented cabin in northern Idaho in late October of 2017. I was 31 at the time, and I had been looking for a quiet place to stay for a few days to escape work and the constant noise of the city. I chose that exact cabin because it sat deep inside a stretch of old forest, almost an hour from the nearest small town. The road was narrow and covered in fallen leaves, and after parking my truck beside the cabin, I could only hear trees rubbing against each other in the cold wind. I remember thinking that the place looked older than the pictures online. The wood on the outside was faded and parts of the roof looked patched with metal sheets that didn't match the rest. Inside, it smelled like old wood and dust, and the light bulbs were dim even when turned up all the way. There was a single bedroom, a tiny bathroom, and a small living area that had an old couch and a wood stove. The landlord told me there was no cell service and the only electricity came from a small line connected down the hill, so storms could cut it off. I didn't think much about that when I first arrived. I wanted quiet. I thought I would enjoy the silence for a change. The first night passed without anything unusual. I made a simple dinner, sat on the couch, and listened to wind moving around the cabin. I remember feeling a little uneasy when the trees creaked, but I convinced myself it was normal for a cold night in the woods. I went to bed early and woke up a few times because the cabin made noises I wasn't used to, but I managed to sleep anyway. The second day, I hiked further up the hill behind the cabin. The weather stayed gray all morning and the sky looked heavy, like rain would start at any moment. I walked maybe 2 miles, moving through tall pines and thick undergrowth. At one point, I noticed old metal fence posts sticking out of the ground, rusted and bent, but no actual fence. I wondered what they were used for, maybe an old property line or something like that. When I came back down in the afternoon, something felt off. Nothing looked moved exactly, but I kept getting the feeling that someone had been near the cabin while I was away. There were patches of dirt around the steps that looked freshly disturbed, but I thought maybe an animal walked through. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that eyes had been on my place while I was gone. That night was colder. I put more wood in the stove and tried to read, but my mind kept drifting back to that strange feeling. The wind was stronger, hitting the sides of the cabin harder, and the metal roof made pinging sounds as if tiny rocks were falling on it. At some point, I thought I heard something heavy shift outside, like footsteps on gravel, but I told myself it was branches falling or maybe a deer moving around. I fell asleep close to midnight but woke again at around 3 in the morning. The room was freezing and the fire had died down. When I went to add more wood, I noticed something near the bottom of the front door. A thin line of fresh dirt stretched across the floor, almost like someone had pushed soil under the door. I stared at it for a minute, thinking it had to be from the wind or maybe the draft pulling in dust, but it looked too specific. I cleaned it up and tried to ignore it. On the third day, I woke up to light snow falling. The ground around the cabin was covered in thin white patches. I felt calmer in the daylight. Snow made the forest look brighter and quieter. I stepped outside and walked around the cabin, trying to see if animals had been digging around the foundation or under the steps. That's when I saw a single footprint in the snow near the back window. It was large, a man's boot print, pointing toward the trees. Only one print, not a pair, just one. I stared at it for a long time. The snow was fresh, so the print had to be new, probably overnight. I looked around carefully but found no other prints. It was as if someone had stepped there and then stepped somewhere else without leaving a mark, which made no sense. But I reminded myself snow can melt unevenly, and maybe the rest got covered fast. I tried to think like that, but my stomach stayed tight the rest of the morning. Later that afternoon, the power went out. 1 second the lights were dim, the next everything went dark. I checked the breaker, but it wasn't that. Outside, the air felt heavier, like a storm was close. The sky had darkened fast, and I thought maybe the line down the hill failed. The silence without electricity felt deeper than before. I started a fire early and decided to go to bed soon after sunset. But I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing soft movement outside. Not constant, but enough to keep me awake. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to faint crunches in the snow, slow and spaced apart, like someone was trying to move without being heard. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a deer or elk, but my mind kept thinking about that single footprint. At around 2 in the morning, I thought I heard something brush against the side of the cabin. The wood made a low rubbing sound. I sat up and waited, barely breathing. A few minutes later, something lightly tapped one of the windows at the back of the cabin. A soft pop like a finger tapping glass. I froze. I didn't move for at least 10 minutes. The tapping didn't happen again. I waited until dawn before getting up. I made coffee on the stove using a little camping burner since the power was still out. I forced myself to look out the back window. I expected to see more prints, but there was nothing new. The snow around the cabin looked untouched except where I had walked earlier. That somehow frightened me more, like whatever had been there knew how to avoid leaving tracks. Around noon, I decided I would leave early. My plan had been to stay 4 nights, but I already felt like I had stayed too long. The snow kept falling harder and visibility got worse. I packed my things fast, tossed them in the truck, and walked around one last time checking windows and doors. Everything seemed normal, except I noticed fresh scratches on one of the cabin's wooden window frames. 3 thin lines, like someone dragged something sharp downward slowly. The drive back to the small town was slow because snow covered most of the road. I kept checking the rearview mirror even though I knew nothing was behind me. My hands were shaking the whole way. When I finally got into town, the power was working there and people were walking around normally. I remember feeling strange watching everyone go about their day like nothing was wrong. I booked a cheap motel room for that night instead of driving all the way home. I could not stop thinking about what I heard and what I saw. I kept replaying the tapping on the glass and those scratches on the window frame. I didn't know if someone had been watching me for days, or if it was just some stranger moving through the woods who happened to pass near my cabin. The next morning, I returned home in daylight. I told myself over and over that I had overreacted, that my mind just filled in blanks because I was far from people and because the cabin was old and noisy. But later that week, I received a message from the cabin's owner letting me know that someone had broken into one of the other empty cabins farther up the hill around the same time I was there. Nothing was stolen, but the lock was forced and the door left partly open. The owner also mentioned that locals had seen a tall man walking the forest roads alone during bad weather, and nobody ever knew where he stayed. Hearing that made everything fall into place in a way I wish it hadn't. All the little things I tried to ignore suddenly felt real. The dirt under the door, the single footprint, the movement outside, and the tapping on the window all pointed to someone actually being there at night. Someone close enough to touch the cabin, close enough to scratch the wood next to the glass where I had been sleeping just a few feet away. I have gone camping and hiking many times since then, but I have never stayed alone in a remote cabin again. I still think about those nights when wind hits the windows in my apartment. I imagine that dark forest outside and the sound of slow steps in the snow, spaced apart like someone taking their time. I know there were no ghosts or anything supernatural out there. What scares me most is that it was just a person. A real person moving around that cabin in the middle of the night, watching a place they knew someone was sleeping inside, waiting quietly in the dark where nobody could see them. It was the fall of 1997 when I ended up at that old farm cabin in the outskirts of Black Hollow, a forgotten stretch of land halfway between the last town and the forest. I was 24, burned out from city life, and convinced that a few weeks away in the country would clear my head. The cabin belonged to my late uncle, who I hadn't been close to. He died a couple of years prior, and the property had been left to me. I didn't know much about farming or cabins or anything like that, but the solitude called to me in a way nothing in the city ever could. I drove up the rutted dirt road in my rusted Honda, the tires crunching over loose stones and fallen leaves. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin sat, the sun was a dull orange smear on the horizon. The cabin itself was small, made of darkened pine logs, the roof sagging slightly under years of neglect. A metal chimney leaned precariously to one side, the flue caked with rust. The windows were dusty and streaked with spiderwebs. It smelled faintly of old wood and damp earth. I should have hesitated when I first stepped out, but I didn't. There was a strange peace in the isolation, though I didn't yet realize that peace was fragile. Inside, the cabin smelled stronger, a mixture of mildew and old animal droppings. The floors creaked loudly under my boots, and the furniture was sparse. A rough table, a couple of chairs, a narrow bed in the corner with a faded mattress. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light coming through the grimy windows. I set my backpack down and ran my hand over the table, noticing deep scratches in the wood, like someone had dragged something heavy across it. I chalked it up to old farm work and moved on. I spent the first day cleaning, hauling out cobwebs and swept up years of dirt. I stacked firewood by the hearth and checked the well outside. Water was clear but cold and tasted faintly of iron. I told myself that this was going to be the perfect escape. Fresh air, quiet nights, and just me and the old cabin. By nightfall, I had a small fire going and was dozing in the chair when I first heard the noises. At first, it was subtle, soft thumps outside, almost like the wind rattling something loose in the barn. But then I realized the thumps had a rhythm, deliberate, like something or someone was walking around the perimeter of the cabin. I froze, listening, but the sound stopped as soon as I held my breath. I told myself it was a deer or a raccoon, but the unease in my stomach refused to settle. The rest of the night I stayed awake, listening to the creaks of the old structure, imagining shadows moving through the woods. The next day, I decided to explore the rest of the property. There was a small barn, long abandoned, with one side partially collapsed. Inside, hay was rotted, and old rusted tools were scattered about. The wind through the broken windows whistled eerily. I found a feed trough with scratch marks around it, bigger than any animal I knew. I felt a twinge of worry, but told myself again it was just the cabin's history, decades of farm animals leaving their mark. By the third day, I started noticing other things. The farm gate, a few hundred yards from the cabin, had been closed the day before, but now it was slightly ajar. I hadn't touched it. The firewood I had stacked neatly was disturbed, a few pieces knocked over. I tried to rationalize wind, maybe a stray animal, but the sense of being watched was growing, thickening like fog in my chest. Then, around sunset, I saw it. Not through the cabin window, but out in the field beyond the barn. Figure hunched, moving slowly. I froze, heart hammering. Whoever or whatever it wasn't carrying anything. Just moving through the tall, dying grass, silent, deliberate. I watched it until it disappeared behind a line of trees at the edge of the property. My hands were shaking as I locked the doors and windows and sat by the fire for the rest of the night, not daring to sleep. By the fifth day, things escalated. I started hearing noises inside the cabin. Footsteps on the creaking floorboards, soft but unmistakable. Once, I heard the scratching of nails across the walls. Objects moved while I wasn't looking. A cup that had been on the table was now on the floor, a chair nudged out of place. I began keeping a small hatchet by the door, though I hated to imagine myself having to use it. My mind refused to accept the possibility of another human intruder, but the fear gnawed at me constantly. One evening, I ventured outside to check the perimeter with a flashlight. I went around the cabin slowly, heart in my throat. The beam of light caught on something near the barn. Footprints. Large, muddy, not from a deer or any animal I recognized. They led from the tree line to the barn and back toward the cabin. I followed them, my stomach twisting, and realized they circled the cabin over and over, like someone had been pacing there for hours. I decided to leave the next morning. I had enough of this tension, enough of feeling like the walls were closing in, enough of the heavy eyes in the shadows. But that night, I could hardly sleep. At 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by the sound of glass shattering. I grabbed the hatchet and crept toward the source, the kitchen window. The pane was cracked, and outside in the moonlight, I saw nothing but shadows of the trees. The front door rattled, a low, heavy sound, and I felt the panic rising, sharp and sudden. By dawn, I had made a plan. I would pack what I could and leave before the day got too far. I stepped outside with my backpack, eyes scanning the treeline. That's when I noticed tracks leading toward the cabin from the woods. Not human exactly, though they were too large and deliberate to be a deer. They moved through the field, around the barn, stopping at the edge of the porch as if whoever or whatever had been waiting. I didn't hesitate. I jumped in my car, tires spinning in the loose dirt as I sped down the road, glancing in the rearview mirror to see the barn disappear into the morning fog. It wasn't until I was safely back in town that I allowed myself to breathe. I called a local real estate agent, told them I wanted to sell the cabin immediately, no questions asked. I never went back. Over the years, I kept thinking about those nights. The thumps, the footprints, the feeling of being watched. Sometimes I would wonder if it had been another person, maybe a trespasser or someone with a history on that land. Sometimes I would convince myself it had been an animal I didn't recognize, one that had learned to stalk quietly. I never found out, and part of me didn't want to. What I do know is this: the cabin wasn't haunted by ghosts, but it was haunted by something real. Something patient, careful, and invisible in plain sight. That autumn taught me that isolation can be dangerous in ways the mind cannot always predict. It's not the fairy tales you have to fear, but the quiet persistence of something alive and watching. And sometimes, leaving is the only way to survive. Even now, decades later, when I pass Black Hollow on the highway, I can't help but glance toward the tree line where that cabin once stood, wondering what would happen if I ever stopped by. I never do. Some pieces of real fear I've learned are best left alone. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to escape the noise of city life. I had just turned 27, and the constant grind of office work was wearing me down. My plan was simple: rent a small cabin in the northern woods of Vermont for a week, away from phones, traffic, and deadlines. I had found the cabin online, a modest, weathered structure tucked into the dense forest near a small, almost forgotten lake. Pictures made it look cozy, almost quaint, with peeling white paint and a sagging porch. The reviews were sparse but positive. I thought it would be the perfect retreat. The drive there was long. The asphalt ended halfway through, and I followed a gravel road that twisted through towering pines. Sunlight struggled through the thick canopy, and the air smelled sharp and earthy, like damp moss. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low, sending golden streaks through the branches. The place looked exactly like the pictures, but in person, it had a sort of grim heaviness. The windows were dusty, the front door groaned when I opened it, and the hinges rattled as if the cabin itself had been holding its breath, waiting. Inside, it was musty, with the smell of old wood and something faintly metallic that I couldn't place. The furniture was sparse. A small dining table, a couple of chairs, a sagging couch, and a bed with a lumpy mattress. The fireplace was blackened with old soot. I unpacked quickly, setting my bag on the bed, and decided to explore the surrounding area before dark. The forest around the cabin was thick, the trees tightly packed and ancient-looking. Birds chirped occasionally, but the further I walked, the quieter it became. I found a small path that led down to the lake. The water was dark and still, reflecting the twisted branches above like some liquid mirror. I stood there for a while, breathing the clean, cold air, feeling a sense of calm settle over me. It was exactly what I had come for, or so I thought. When I returned to the cabin, the sun had set completely. Shadows filled the corners of the room, and the forest outside turned into a wall of black. I lit a couple of candles I had brought and prepared a simple dinner. That's when I noticed it. A woman standing just beyond the edge of the trees, visible through the window. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. But no, she was real. She was thin, her long dark hair tangled and hanging around her face. Her clothes were old and dirty, and she stood perfectly still, just staring at the cabin. My stomach twisted. I hadn't seen anyone else on the drive, and this forest was supposed to be deserted. I tried to convince myself she was just a local wandering near the lake, maybe someone who lived nearby. But something about the way she stood there, watching, felt deliberate. I couldn't see her eyes clearly, but I felt them burning into me. I locked the door, checked the windows, and tried to focus on something else, but I kept seeing her reflected in the glass. Each time I looked away and back, she hadn't moved, yet somehow seemed closer. My heart rate picked up, and a knot of fear formed in my chest. I remembered the small pocket knife I always carried for camping trips. I kept it in my hand, just in case. Hours passed. I tried to read, I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched never left. Around midnight, I heard a scratching noise at the door. It was soft, deliberate, like nails dragging across the wood. I froze. The sound stopped for a moment, then started again, faster this time, sharper. My breath came in shallow bursts. I grabbed a flashlight and moved slowly to the door, shining the beam into the darkness. No one was there. My pulse slowed slightly, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't left. I backed away and decided to barricade the door with the old wooden chair. The legs of the chair scraped against the floor, loud in the otherwise silent cabin. I didn't hear anything after that for a few minutes until the scratching started again. But this time from the window. I moved to the window, flashlight in hand. Through the glass, I could see her standing among the trees, just outside the reach of the candlelight. She didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. A chill ran down my spine, and I stumbled backward. My phone was in my bag. I grabbed it and tried to dial 911, but there was no signal. Panic welled up. I thought about driving back the way I had come, but the gravel road was narrow, and I wasn't sure if she might be waiting along it. Then I remembered the cabin's fireplace. I grabbed an old log and shoved it into the burning embers. The flames roared, and I picked up the poker. Something about holding it made me feel slightly more in control. I paced the cabin, checking doors and windows repeatedly, trying to convince myself it was just someone lost or mentally ill, not a real threat. But deep down, I knew better. Hours passed, maybe until 3 a.m., and she never left. Eventually, exhaustion overtook my fear, and I forced myself to sleep in the corner of the room with the flashlight and knife within reach. I woke intermittently, thinking I saw movement outside, but every time I turned on the light, she was just there, silent and still. When morning finally came, I dared to look out the window. The sun filtered weakly through the trees, and for the first time, I saw her fully. Her clothes were tattered, caked with mud. Her face was pale and dirty, her eyes dark and unreadable. She didn't run when I opened the door. She just stood there, watching. I realized I couldn't stay. I packed my things quickly, my hands shaking, and prepared to leave by the road. As I stepped outside, she didn't move, didn't follow. I started my car and kept my eyes on the tree line as I drove off. Every few miles, I would glance in the rearview mirror, but she was gone. Later, when I returned home and told a local ranger about what I had seen, he told me that there had been reports of a woman living in the woods nearby. She was known to wander near cabins, but no one had ever had a close encounter before. People called her the Woods Woman and said she had been living there for years after leaving her family under unknown circumstances. I never went back to that part of Vermont. Even years later, I can still picture her standing silently among the trees, her dark hair hanging around her face, just watching. I keep a flashlight and knife handy when I camp, not because I expect her to appear again, but because the memory of that night made me realize how vulnerable you can feel in a place that should feel safe. The forest, the cabin, everything looked so peaceful in daylight, but I learned the hard way that peace can be a thin mask for something much darker, something that doesn't need to move or speak to make you afraid. I arrived in late October of 1996, long before the sun went down, because I did not want to drive through the countryside in the dark. The dirt road felt narrow and uneven under my truck tires, and there were tall trees on both sides that blocked most of the sky. I could already smell the cold in the air when I rolled the window down. The cabin I rented for a few nights was close to an old graveyard that people said was abandoned and ignored by the nearby town. I never cared about small talk like that because most people exaggerate everything. I only wanted some quiet time away from work, away from the city, away from the noise that followed me every day. I could see the cabin roof through the trees when the path finally opened. It looked older than the pictures online, with faded wood that looked like it had not seen fresh paint since the early 70s. The windows were dusty from the outside, and the small porch leaned slightly to the right like the ground under it had shifted over time. I carried my bag inside and noticed the air smelled like old wood and damp leaves. The floor creaked under every step I took, even the slow ones. There was only one bedroom, a small kitchen, a bathroom, and a living room with a fireplace that looked like it had not been used for years. The place felt cold, so I set my bag down and went around closing windows. When I finished, I walked outside again to take a look at the graveyard while there was still some daylight. I knew it was behind the cabin, only a short walk up a small slope. The ground felt soft under the dried leaves, and every step made a hard crunching sound. I passed a few trees with branches that hung so low they almost touched the ground. The graveyard was small, maybe 20 or 30 headstones. Some were leaning, some were cracked, and some were only small markers barely coming out of the dirt. I read a few names, but most of them were too faded or covered in moss. I tried to imagine who these people were, but I honestly did not want to think too much about it. Something about standing in a place where time barely existed made my stomach feel uneasy. I headed back before darkness came. I locked the door and turned on a few lamps. The cabin felt less cold, but still lonely. I heated a small meal on the stove, ate it slowly, and listened to the soft wind hitting the outside walls. After I cleaned up, I sat near the window and watched the trees move in the dark. I could see part of the graveyard hill when the moonlight came through a thin opening in the clouds. I noticed a shape between two trees. It looked like a person standing there, but I told myself it was just a tree trunk or my eyes playing tricks. I stared at it until the clouds covered the moon again and everything turned dark. I closed the curtains and tried to settle down for the night. Sleeping was harder than I expected. The cabin made quiet sounds every few minutes, like wood shifting. I kept thinking about that shape near the trees. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but my thoughts kept going back to it. At some point, I forced myself to get up and check the locks again. They were all fine. I woke up around 3 in the morning without knowing what made me wake up. The room was cold, colder than when I went to sleep. The wind had picked up outside. I could hear branches hitting the side of the cabin. I stared at the ceiling for a while and tried to go back to sleep, but I could not. I felt watched, even though I knew that made no sense. When morning finally came, I felt tired and slow. I made coffee and walked outside. The ground was covered with wet leaves, and everything looked gray from the heavy clouds. I walked toward the graveyard again, maybe to convince myself I had imagined everything. Nothing looked different, but when I reached the edge of the graves, I noticed fresh dirt on one of the older plots. It looked like someone had moved soil, not a lot, but enough to notice. It didn't look like an animal did it because the soil was moved evenly. I told myself it was probably just rain washing away the top layer, but the dirt looked too clean and dark, like it had been turned recently. My stomach felt tight again. I turned back and went to the cabin. During the day, I tried to read a book, but I kept glancing at the window. The trees moved gently in the wind. I heard a faint sound in the distance, like someone walking through leaves. I kept trying to ignore it. When afternoon came, I forced myself to take a walk farther into the woods, away from the graveyard side, just to clear my mind. The forest felt calm on that side, and I started to believe I was overthinking everything. When evening came again, the sky turned dark faster than the night before. Clouds became heavier, and the wind picked up again. I sat inside with the lights on, trying to focus on the book. I kept hearing something outside, like movement through leaves. Every time I looked toward the window, I saw nothing. Later in the night, I heard what sounded like footsteps on the porch, slow and careful, like someone trying not to be heard. My heart started beating fast. I stood still and listened. The sound stopped. Then I heard the faint creak of wood, like weight shifting on the old boards outside. I went to the kitchen, grabbed the heavy metal flashlight I brought with me, and stood near the door. I did not open it. I only listened. Nothing happened after that. So after a while, I stepped away and tried to calm myself. I sat in the living room, and it felt like the cabin was shrinking around me. The silence felt heavy, and every little noise became louder inside my head. I slept with the bedroom door open that night, which I never do. I kept the lamp on like a child afraid of the dark. I could not shake the feeling someone had been outside. The next morning, I walked around the porch. The wood was covered with fresh mud. I looked down and saw footprints. They were not animal prints, they were clearly shoe prints, heavy ones like someone wearing boots. The prints came from the direction of the graveyard and stopped near the door, then turned back toward the trees. My stomach dropped. That meant someone was out here during the night. Someone had walked right up to the cabin. I looked toward the graveyard hill. Even in daylight, I felt a chill climb my spine. I decided I could not stay another night. I packed my things quickly. Before leaving, I walked a few steps toward the graveyard, even though every instinct told me not to. I saw the same grave with the dark soil. It looked even more disturbed, like someone had dug into it deeper during the night. I stared at it, and I could swear I saw something moving under the leaves near the edge of the grave, like loose dirt sliding slowly. But I did not wait to find out what caused it. I got into my truck and drove out fast. The trees felt like they were closing behind me as I went. The road seemed longer going out than coming in. When I finally reached the main road, I felt a weight lift off me, like I had escaped something I could not fully understand. For days after I got back to the city, I kept thinking about those footprints and that disturbed grave. There was nothing supernatural about what I saw, and that is what made it worse in a way. Someone had been there. Someone had walked near that graveyard in the middle of the night and came up to the cabin. Someone was digging in that ground. I never reported it because I could not explain it without sounding strange, and I worried nobody would believe me. But I know what I saw, and I know how real the fear felt. Every time I think about that place, I picture those old stones, the dark soil, and the heavy boot prints coming from the hill. I still wonder what that person was doing there, and what they were looking for under that dirt. I learned something on that trip. Sometimes the scariest things are not the things we cannot explain, but the ones we can. It was the fall of 1987, and I was 24, a city kid used to the constant hum of traffic and streetlights. I had taken a small leave from my job in Boston, desperate for some solitude and a chance to clear my head. I ended up renting a small, run-down cabin deep in the Vermont woods, somewhere near a little-known town called Northfield. The cabin was old, the kind of place that hadn't seen a proper repair in decades, standing at the edge of a private graveyard that locals warned me about when I called to confirm the rental. I brushed it off, thinking old cemeteries were romantic and quiet, a place to read and think. I had no idea what I was walking into. The drive out from the highway was longer than expected. The narrow dirt road twisted through the woods, fallen leaves crunching under my tires, and I noticed the sunlight fading faster than it should have. By the time I reached the last curve, the forest was thick and shadowed, the air cooler and damp. The cabin itself looked smaller in person. Its wooden siding was gray and weathered, windows dusty, and the porch sagged slightly under its own weight. There was a thin layer of moss covering the roof. A rickety wooden fence separated the cabin from the graveyard behind it, leaning in odd angles, and the headstones were old, some cracked, some tilting at impossible angles, with dates stretching back to the 1800s. I parked and stepped out, the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves hitting me. I carried my bag to the cabin and pushed the creaking door open. The inside was cold and musty, the air thick with dust. Sunlight barely reached through the grimy windows. A single room, mostly empty, with a fireplace full of old ashes and a small kitchenette in one corner. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and I realized there was a lot more maintenance needed than the rental listing had suggested. The first night passed quietly, almost too quietly. I lit a fire in the fireplace, the crackle of burning wood filling the room, and sat with my back against the wall, staring at the shadows moving in the corners. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and occasionally, I thought I heard the snap of a branch from the graveyard behind the cabin. At first, I assumed it was deer or raccoons. The area was wild, after all. But there was a rhythm to it that unsettled me, like something moving deliberately. The next morning, I explored the property. The graveyard was larger than I expected, stretching farther into the trees than the fence indicated. The tombstones were old and mostly illegible. Some had fallen entirely, cracked in half, and I noticed deep gouges in the wood and stone, marks that looked like something or someone had been digging. I couldn't explain it at the time, just a trick of the light or animals, I told myself. Over the next few days, the feeling of being watched grew. I started hearing things at night, soft footsteps on the porch, the scraping of metal, the low creak of branches against the cabin walls. I would wake up and stare out the window, expecting to see raccoons or a stray dog, but the woods were always empty, silent except for the wind and the distant rustle of leaves. My sleep became restless, nightmares creeping in, dreams of being buried alive, of figures moving in the shadows between the trees. Each morning, I would wake covered in sweat, telling myself it was just exhaustion and anxiety. On the fourth night, something happened that changed everything. I had just gone to bed when I heard it. A scraping sound, closer than before, coming from the edge of the graveyard. My heart started pounding, but I forced myself to stay still, hoping it was nothing. Then I heard a low groan, unmistakable, human, but strained and muffled, like someone struggling under weight. I grabbed the flashlight by the bed and shined it toward the graveyard. At first, I saw nothing, only the uneven lines of headstones and the twisted trunks of the trees. Then the beam caught movement. A dark figure crouched by a grave, shoveling something. My stomach dropped. It wasn't a person just wandering. They were working, moving deliberately, the shovel striking the earth in harsh, quick strokes. I froze, not sure whether to call the police. My phone had no signal, of course. I considered running to the neighbor's house, if there even was a neighbor close enough to hear me, but the figure didn't seem to notice me yet. Then, a sudden gust of wind caused the flashlight to flicker. When I shined it back, the figure was gone. I thought maybe I had imagined it, or that it had been a deer or some kind of animal manipulating a fallen branch and a mound of dirt. I tried to sleep, but every creak, every whistle of the wind, kept me on edge. The next day, I approached the graveyard. My stomach churned as I walked past the leaning fence. I reached the spot where I had seen the figure. The ground was disturbed, the soil freshly turned, and I realized with a sinking feeling that it was a shallow grave, about 2 or 3 feet deep. I looked around, no tracks, no sign of where the person went. It was almost like they had disappeared into the forest itself. I decided I couldn't stay. The rental cabin suddenly felt like a trap, isolated and vulnerable. I packed quickly, trying to move as quietly as possible, and kept my eyes on the graveyard as I loaded my car. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There was a new headstone in the graveyard, small and unpolished, freshly dug. The name was scratched into it hastily, uneven letters, M. Lane, 1965 to 1987. I recognized the year 1987. My mind raced. Could someone have been buried alive? Had the figure I saw been digging a grave for me? I didn't wait to find out. I jumped in the car, heart hammering, and drove off the dirt road as fast as I could. The forest seemed to close behind me, branches scratching at the sides of the car, but I didn't stop until I reached the highway. I reported the grave and the cabin to the authorities when I got cell reception a few towns over. By the time the police investigated, the grave was gone and the cabin was empty. Locals later told me the cabin had been used by a small-time criminal hiding out, someone who had been burying victims in the graveyard for years. It was never widely publicized. Authorities quietly removed the graves and condemned the cabin. I never went back to Vermont. Even now, decades later, I can't drive past rural cemeteries without a shiver. The memory of that night, the figure, the shovel, the newly dug grave, sticks with me. What saved me was nothing supernatural, nothing fantastical. It was awareness, quick thinking, and sheer luck. I realized too late that solitude in the wrong place can turn deadly, and that sometimes even the quietest places hide the darkest secrets. I still keep a small flashlight in my car, always check my surroundings in remote areas, and never underestimate the stillness of a forest at night, because what I saw that night was real, and it almost ended me. It was the summer of 1987, and I had just turned 23. I had been driving through the northern part of Montana, somewhere between the Bitterroot Mountains and the edge of the plains. I was on a solo trip, trying to clear my head after a rough breakup. My old Jeep had been bouncing along gravel roads for hours, and the only signs of life were the occasional deer or hawk circling overhead. I hadn't planned on stopping anywhere, but then I noticed it. A cabin tucked deep into a small clearing, hidden by thick pine trees. Its roof sagged in the middle, and the paint had long since peeled away, leaving the wood underneath gray and brittle. It wasn't marked on any of the maps I had, and the road leading to it seemed to disappear into the forest. Curiosity got the better of me. I parked the Jeep on the side of the overgrown path and stepped out. The air smelled damp and earthy, heavy with the scent of pine needles and decay. The cabin was small, maybe 2 rooms, and it looked like no one had touched it for decades. The windows were grimy and cracked, the glass brittle, and one was partially broken, letting in a jagged stream of sunlight that highlighted the dust inside. The door hung crooked on its hinges, and I had to push it carefully to avoid breaking it off entirely. Inside, the air was stale, the kind of smell that makes your nose wrinkle and your throat dry. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and I had to be careful where I stepped. There were remnants of someone's life here. A rusted metal bed frame in one corner, a stove with a few blackened pots still inside, and a small wooden table with peeling varnish. The walls were lined with shelves that held nothing but empty jars and cobwebs. It was silent except for the occasional sound of wind sneaking through the cracks, rattling the old window panes. I wandered through the cabin slowly, almost expecting to see signs of wildlife, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel, but there was nothing. The place felt abandoned, but not in the way a cabin in the woods sometimes does when people leave for a season. This was long-term abandonment, the kind that made your skin crawl without any clear reason. I moved toward the back room, where the floor sloped dangerously and the roof dipped low. Here, I found a set of stairs leading down to what looked like a basement. The steps were covered in dust and dirt, and the wood groaned under my weight. I hesitated, feeling a knot in my stomach, but curiosity pushed me forward. The basement was darker than the cabin itself, the single window too small to let in much light. My flashlight revealed old furniture stacked against the walls, broken chairs, a cracked trunk, and a rusted oil can. The smell here was worse, metallic, with a hint of mold. I stepped carefully, feeling the floor beneath me as though it might give way at any moment. That's when I noticed it, marks on the wall. Not drawings or graffiti, just scratches. They were deep, long lines running vertically across the wood. Whoever had been here had used something sharp, maybe a knife or a crowbar. The scratches weren't new, but they weren't ancient either. They gave me a chill. I felt like I had just stepped into someone else's private fear. I kept moving, exploring the corner where the trunk was sitting. I knelt down and opened it carefully. Inside were old clothes, yellowed and tattered, and a stack of newspapers from the early 70s. I flipped through them, noticing headlines about local murders and disappearances, small things that had barely made the papers. It was strange, almost like whoever had lived here had been collecting every bad event, every misfortune, as if the cabin itself was a record of pain. I decided to leave the basement and go back upstairs, but that's when I heard it. A faint tapping sound, rhythmic, coming from outside. At first, I thought it was a branch hitting the side of the cabin, but the sound didn't stop. It moved slowly around the building, coming closer to the windows. My heart started racing, and I gripped my flashlight like a weapon. I peeked out through one of the cracked panes and saw nothing but the forest. Yet the tapping continued. I could hear it on the roof now, small, deliberate, like someone or something was circling the cabin. Panic started to creep in, but I forced myself to breathe and think. I wasn't a kid. I was 23, alone but not stupid. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, keeping my eyes on the treeline. That's when I saw it. Footprints. Not animal prints, though. They were too human, too large, leading from the woods to the cabin and back again. They were fresh, like someone had been pacing, waiting. The realization hit me. I was not alone. I got back to the Jeep as quickly as I could, my boots crunching on the gravel. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the keys. The engine roared to life, the headlights cutting through the shadowed forest. I drove slowly at first, scanning the treeline for any sign of movement. The footprints ran alongside the road for a while, but then they disappeared, swallowed up by the pine needles and undergrowth. My stomach was tight with fear, but I knew I couldn't stop. I drove for another hour, sticking to the gravel paths and avoiding the main highway. I needed to reach a town, somewhere with people, lights, and safety. By the time I saw the first lights of a small town, probably Plains, Montana, I felt like I could finally breathe again. The tension in my shoulders started to release, though the memory of the cabin haunted me. That night, I stayed at a motel and barely slept, replaying the scratches, the footprints, and the sound of tapping. I couldn't shake the feeling that the cabin wasn't just abandoned. Someone had been living there, or at least watching it. The next morning, I went to the local diner for breakfast and talked to the waitress. She listened as I asked about abandoned cabins in the area. Her expression hardened when I mentioned the one near the forest trail I'd come from. She told me that the cabin had been empty for years, but people used to say a man lived there, keeping to himself, mostly avoiding anyone. He was never violent, but he liked privacy and didn't welcome visitors. Some claimed he had moved back in recently, though no one had confirmed it. I didn't push further. I had my answer, and it was enough. After that, I decided to leave Montana sooner than planned. The memory of the cabin stayed with me, but not in the way of nightmares. It reminded me that isolation can make a place feel alive, even without anyone there. The scratching on the walls, the footprints, the tapping. It wasn't supernatural, it was just human behavior left to its own devices. The lesson stayed. Curiosity can get you into dangerous situations, but awareness and caution can get you out. Looking back now, decades later, I can still picture the cabin in my mind. The gray, weathered walls, the sagging roof, the brittle windows. I think about the man who had lived there, the one whose life was so cut off from the world that even the abandoned cabin carried a presence of tension. That summer, I learned that fear doesn't have to be magical or mythical. It can be as real as wood that creaks under your weight and footsteps that follow you through the forest. I never went back to that forest, and I never will. But the experience made me more aware, more careful. I know now that danger isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it's quiet, patient, and just waiting for you to make a mistake. The old cabin didn't hurt anyone, but it taught me one of the most valuable lessons of my life. Respect isolation, respect the unknown, and never underestimate the human element in a place that seems empty. It was the summer of 2018, and I was 23. My stepsister Miranda had passed away unexpectedly a few months earlier, leaving her small cabin deep in the woods outside Ashford, Maine. She had always been a bit of a recluse, preferring the quiet and isolation of the forest to the bustling city where I lived. When I inherited her cabin, I wasn't sure why I wanted it. Part of me felt drawn to her, to the life she had lived alone, and part of me thought I could confront the grief that had been eating at me since the funeral. The first time I drove up the winding dirt road to the cabin, the air felt heavier than normal, thick with humidity and the smell of pine. The forest around the cabin was dense, dark, and oddly silent. Birds and insects were there, but their noises seemed muted, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. I parked my old Subaru near the cabin's porch and stared at it. It was small, a simple one-story structure with weathered wooden siding and a roof that sagged slightly in the middle. The windows were clouded with grime and age, giving the place a look of having been forgotten. I stepped onto the porch, my boots creaking against the old boards. The front door was unlocked, something I had already been warned about in her will. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust, wood, and something faintly sweet that reminded me of old candles. Sunlight filtered through the grimy windows, casting faint lines of light across the floor. I walked slowly, taking it all in. The furniture was sparse, practical. A small couch, a worn armchair, a table with peeling varnish, and her bed in the corner, neatly made despite her passing. I spent the first few hours just exploring. There were shelves lined with books, mystery novels, old survival guides, and journals. Miranda had been meticulous with her writing. I ran my fingers over the spines, feeling a strange connection to her life through these objects. Then I came across the back door, which led to a small, overgrown clearing behind the cabin. The grass was tall, wet from recent rain, and the air smelled of damp earth. Beyond the clearing, the forest thickened, and I could see the faint outline of a trail leading further into the woods. That night, I slept uneasily in her bed, the wind whistling through cracks in the cabin walls. Every creak of the floorboards made me flinch. Around 2 a.m, I woke to a sound outside, like someone dragging a heavy branch across the ground. My heart raced. I sat up, straining to hear, but the sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Over the next few days, I tried to settle in, unpacking a few things I had brought from the city. I had intended to stay only a week, but the solitude drew me in. I began to notice small details about the cabin I hadn't seen at first. The back door latch was rusted and difficult to open. Some of the windows didn't lock properly. There were scratches on the floor near the kitchen, shallow but deliberate, as if something had clawed at the wood. I chalked it up to age or her cat. I had seen one small white cat in some of her photos, but a small part of me couldn't ignore the thought that it felt deliberate. One afternoon, I decided to explore the woods. I packed a backpack with water, a flashlight, and a small first aid kit, telling myself I just wanted to stretch my legs. The trail behind the cabin was barely noticeable at first, swallowed by bushes and tall grass. I followed it anyway, pushing branches aside, listening to the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. The further I went, the darker it became. The trees were thick here, their trunks twisted and close together, leaving the path in near constant shadow. I felt my chest tighten. The air was cooler under the canopy, and there was an almost imperceptible smell of smoke, like something had burned recently. After about an hour, I stumbled upon a clearing. It was circular, maybe 20 feet across, the grass flattened in the middle, like it had been used for something. In the center lay a pile of charred wood, the remnants of a fire long gone cold. Around it, I noticed small items, half buried in dirt or moss. Pieces of broken glass, bits of paper, even what looked like an old, rusted knife handle. My stomach sank. This was not part of Miranda's life. Whoever had been here had left signs of activity I hadn't expected. I took a step back, and that's when I saw it. Footprints leading away from the clearing, heading deeper into the forest. I didn't follow them. I turned back toward the cabin, my pace quickening as the shadows lengthened. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun had dipped behind the trees, leaving the place in near darkness. I locked every door, double-checked the windows, and kept the flashlight by my bed that night. Sleep didn't come easily. Every sound, the wind, the creaking floor, even the hum of insects outside, felt amplified. On the third night, I woke again to noise, louder this time. Something heavy, like footsteps dragging across the porch. My heart was hammering in my chest. I grabbed the baseball bat I had leaned against the wall and crept to the window, peering into the darkness. I saw nothing at first. Then, out of the corner of my eye, a shadow moved. A figure crouched just beyond the edge of the porch light, watching. I froze. My mind raced. I had imagined it. I had to have. I backed away from the window slowly, keeping the bat ready. The next morning, I found evidence that convinced me I wasn't imagining things. On the porch were footprints, muddy and large, circling the entrance. My heart sank when I saw that the back door latch had been tampered with, scratched and bent as if someone had tried to force it open. I realized then that the cabin, as quiet and safe as it seemed during the day, was vulnerable. Someone or something had been here while I slept. I spent the following days fortifying the cabin as best I could. I wedged chairs under door handles, stacked firewood near the windows, and even set up a makeshift alarm system using cans and string along the perimeter. I knew I couldn't rely on anyone coming quickly if something happened. The nearest neighbors were miles away. The forest, beautiful and serene by daylight, had become a prison of anxiety and tension. One evening, as I sat in the cabin's dim light, I noticed the forest beyond the windows growing darker faster than usual. The shadows moved strangely, almost purposefully. My eyes caught a glimpse of something shiny near the tree line, and I realized it was a flashlight beam, moving slowly toward the cabin. My pulse raced. I backed into the corner, bat in hand, breathing shallow. But as the figure came closer, I could see it wasn't a person. It was a deer, caught in the beam of the flashlight I had left outside, its eyes reflecting the light. I laughed nervously at my own fear, the tension easing slightly, but I knew the forest held its secrets, and I was just a guest here. By the end of the week, I felt a strange sense of closure. I had walked the woods, inspected the cabin, and survived the nights of fear that seemed to stretch endlessly. I cleaned the cabin thoroughly, lighting candles and fixing what I could, making it livable and safe. I realized that Miranda's cabin wasn't haunted. It was just vulnerable, like all isolated places are. It demanded respect, attention, and care. Before I left, I stood on the porch one last time, looking out over the clearing and the forest beyond. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the trees, and the air smelled of pine and earth. I understood something important. Fear is a part of life, and the cabin had taught me how to face it, how to move through it without giving in. I locked the door, took one last look at the place, and felt a sense of peace I hadn't known since her passing. The cabin wasn't mine, but it had shown me a strength I hadn't realized I possessed. I drove down the dirt road with the windows open, the wind on my face, carrying away the tension I had brought into the woods. Miranda's life had been short, but in her solitude, she had left behind a space that demanded courage and respect. I had faced it, and in doing so, I had faced a part of myself. The forest, quiet and endless, remained behind me, but I carried a piece of its stillness and its challenge into the world beyond. I had been driving for hours, the sun long gone behind the trees, leaving the dirt road ahead of me dim and uneven in the light of my old headlights. It was the spring of 2011, and I had decided to take a break from everything: work, school, life in the city, and escape for a weekend to the mountains of western Pennsylvania. I was 27, tired of people, of noise, of everything that felt like it was closing in. My friend Lena had told me about a small, old cabin tucked away near an old logging trail, far from any real roads, where I could disappear for a while. She didn't know anyone else who went there. She said it was perfect for solitude. I'd driven up with just my backpack, a few cans of beans, a small bag of rice, a flashlight, and a heavy wool blanket. The cabin was exactly as Lena described: small, boxy, and made of rough, grayed logs that had clearly seen decades of weather. It sat just at the edge of the forest, with a little creek trickling past to one side. The porch sagged a little under its own weight, and the roof had a few missing shingles. From the outside, it was quiet, almost peaceful, though the smell of damp wood and moss hit me immediately as I approached. I unlocked the door with the key Lena had left under a loose stone by the steps, and it creaked loudly as I pushed it open. Inside, it smelled of old pine and dust. There was a small stove in the corner, a wooden table with 2 chairs, and a mattress that looked like it had been thrown on the floor decades ago. It wasn't much, but it was mine for the weekend. I set my bag down, checked the small windows that barely let any light in, and decided to unpack my supplies. As I was arranging the few cans and my flashlight on the counter, I noticed something strange. The floorboards in the middle of the cabin were slightly warped, as though someone had removed them recently and put them back in a hurry. I shook my head and told myself it was nothing. Old cabins settle and shift all the time. I lit a small lantern I had brought, and its flickering light made the cabin feel both cozy and unsettling at the same time. That night, I slept poorly. The wind outside howled through gaps in the logs, and the creak seemed louder than it had during the day. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to a noise that made my stomach tighten. Footsteps. Not outside, but inside. Slow, deliberate, and heavy. My heart jumped. I grabbed the flashlight from the floor and swung it toward the sound. Nothing. The beam caught only the warped floorboards and the shadows they cast. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a branch falling on the roof, maybe an animal had gotten inside. But the sound came again, this time from the other side of the cabin, a low scraping along the wall near the stove. I froze, listening. The wind had died down for a moment, and all I could hear was my own breathing and the creak in the distance. Then the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise itself, and I realized that I hadn't locked the door properly. The idea that someone could have followed me up here and could still be inside the cabin made my skin crawl. I grabbed the small kitchen knife I had brought, my hands shaking. I checked the windows, sturdy, old glass, nothing broken. The door was still closed, though I had left it slightly ajar. I leaned my body against it, feeling the cold wood against my back. Every creak, every groan of the cabin seemed magnified in the darkness. I decided to stay up until sunrise, and I spent the next few hours crouched near the table, the knife in one hand, the flashlight in the other, listening to the shadows move around me. Morning came slowly. The pale light filtering through the tiny windows didn't help with my nerves. It only made the warped floorboards more noticeable. I finally forced myself to stand and check the cabin thoroughly. Nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints other than my own. The warped floorboards, the strange feeling of being watched. It had all been my imagination, I told myself. But as I stepped toward the door, my flashlight beam caught something I hadn't seen before. A faint outline on the wooden porch. It looked like the print of a boot, too big to be mine. I knelt and touched it. Fresh mud, still slightly wet. Panic settled in again. I knew there was no one else supposed to be here, and the nearest neighbors were miles away. I checked my phone. No signal. Great. I couldn't call for help. I had 2 choices. Stay inside, waiting for someone who might not come, or leave the cabin and risk encountering whoever or whatever was out there. My gut told me I couldn't just stay. I packed quickly, throwing the few cans and my blanket into the backpack, and stuffed the knife into my belt. I walked slowly to the edge of the porch, listening. Nothing. I started down the narrow dirt trail that led back to the main road. Every snap of a twig under my foot made my heart pound, and the forest around me seemed impossibly quiet. No birds, no wind, just the sound of my own movement and the creek fading behind me. About halfway down the trail, I froze. There was a sound behind me, low, deliberate footsteps. Not fast, not running, just following, matching my pace. I stopped. The footsteps stopped. I started walking again. They started again. My heart was in my throat. I decided to take the risk and run. I ran as fast as I could, my backpack bouncing against my shoulders, the trail twisting under my feet. I didn't look back. After what felt like 10 minutes, I broke through the trees onto a gravel road, my lungs burning. Car passed by in the distance. I waved frantically, and it slowed, the driver giving me a confused look, but I didn't stop to explain. I just kept moving toward the town a few miles away. When I finally reached a small gas station, I collapsed on the steps, shaking and sweating. I told the attendant I'd had a scare in the woods. He didn't ask for details. I called Lena, my voice trembling. She told me later that the cabin had been abandoned for decades, but there had been reports of people squatting there from time to time, hunters, drifters, sometimes worse. No one really knew who because no one stayed long. I realized I had been lucky, very lucky. I went back home the next week, leaving the mountains behind. I never went back to that cabin. I still think about the warped floorboards, the footsteps in the night, and the boot print on the porch. I don't know if it had been someone living there or if it was just a random stranger who had stumbled upon the place, but I learned something important. Isolation in the wilderness isn't always peaceful. Sometimes it's dangerous, even when the place looks quiet and harmless. Even now, years later, I can remember the sound of those footsteps, the way the lantern light flickered on the walls, and the cold fear crawling up my spine. And every time I go into the woods, even for a short hike, I check the surroundings twice. You never really know who or what might be out there.